In the heart of Miami's elite world, where marble floors shine brighter than truth, a quiet man pushes a mop through a gym that doesn't see him. His name is Walter Reed, a 40-year-old janitor invisible to those he serves. But behind his silence lies a past forged in war, discipline, and pain. When arrogance meets humility, a single moment will shatter illusions. A young fighter's cruelty becomes the spark that reveals the truth. The man they mocked once trained warriors, not for trophies, but for survival. As laughter fades and respect is reborn, the line between strength and dignity is redrawn. The lion rises again, not to fight, but to teach what real power means. A story of racism, redemption, and the quiet strength that changes lives. Watch the full story of A Shadow Over Luxury, a tale where silence speaks louder than pride. Subscribe, stay tuned for the next story, and share if it moved you. The morning light in Oakland spilled through the high windows of the Bayview Martial Arts Academy, cutting thin stripes of gold across the padded floor. The rhythmic slap of bare feet against mats mixed with the sharp crack of gloves meeting targets. Music hummed low from a speaker in the corner, a steady beat that helped young fighters find their rhythm. The air carried the scent of sweat, rubber, and determination. It was the smell of youth convinced of its own invincibility. Dylan Cole thrived in that atmosphere. At 25, he was the star student, the one others glanced at for reassurance, the one whose name appeared on competition posters. He moved like someone aware of every pair of eyes watching him. His body was a study in speed and confidence, each strike precise, each grin slightly sharper than it needed to be. His laughter filled the space easily, spilling into corners, commanding attention the way sunlight claims a room. For Dylan, the gym was not just a place to train, it was his stage, and every movement was a performance meant to remind everyone who led the pack. Near the entrance, an older man stood quietly beside a mop and bucket. Walter Reed's uniform was simple navy coveralls faded from years of washing, boots worn thin, the hotel logo on his chest almost rubbed away. His hair was pepper gray, close-cropped, and his posture upright but unassuming. He moved with the slow efficiency of someone who had done the same job for years without complaint. When he pushed the mop along the edge of the mat, he made sure to stay out of the student's way. His eyes lowered but his awareness sharp. He watched without intruding, saw without judging. Most people in the room barely noticed him, and that suited him fine. Dylan noticed him first because the man did not react to the noise or to his jokes. There was something about that calm, that quiet refusal to be pulled into the rhythm of the room, that unsettled him. When the others were loud, Walter seemed still. When laughter broke out, Walter simply paused, waited, and continued. To someone like Dylan, whose energy depended on being seen, it felt like defiance. He began to test it the way young men often test what they don't understand, with mockery disguised as humor. As Walter passed by with his mop, Dylan raised his voice just enough to reach the group around him. He talked about the good old days, about old-timers still trying to stay close to greatness, and about how some folks never realize when it's time to quit. The jokes came easily, laughter followed, and Walter gave no sign of hearing any of it. He finished a section of the floor, wrung out the mop, and moved to another. The sound of his boots on the tile was steady, unhurried, out of sync with the loud tempo of the gym. When he paused, it wasn't hesitation, but patience, the kind that suggested he moved according to his own rhythm, one that had nothing to do with the voices or glances around him. A few parents sat on folding chairs along the wall, watching the morning classes. Some smiled awkwardly at the teasing, unsure whether it was harmless or cruel. The head instructor, Master Ortega, stood near the back, his arms crossed, observing with a stillness not unlike Walter's. He was a man who had spent a lifetime teaching young people to channel energy into discipline, to temper pride with respect. He did not intervene. Not yet. The sound of a mop bucket rolling broke the chatter for a moment. Walter had moved closer to where the group was stretching between drills. His expression never changed, but something in his bearing demanded space around him. Dylan smirked, tossing his towel aside and raising his voice again. He asked Walter whether he ever got tired of cleaning up after real fighters. Laughter followed, sharper this time. the kind meant to impress rather than amuse. Walter looked up. His gaze found Dylan's without effort. For a heartbeat, the room seemed to hold its breath. There was no anger in his eyes, no embarrassment, no hint of threat, just calm, the kind of calm that comes from knowing something the other person doesn't. Dylan laughed louder, trying to shake off the feeling. He asked another question, something about how old a man could be before his knees gave out, before life stopped teaching him lessons. Still nothing. Walter finished wringing the mop, the motion slow, deliberate. When he turned, the light from the window caught the faint outline of an old scar along his forearm, pale against the darker skin. It was gone in an instant as he rolled his sleeve down again. The rest of the class returned to their drills. Kicks snapped through the air, gloves struck pads, and laughter started to rise again, though softer now, uncertain. But something about the exchange lingered. The rhythm of the room had changed, just slightly, like a song that had slipped off beat. Walter resumed cleaning. His movements were quiet but exact, each turn of the mop like part of a practice sequence. To anyone paying attention, there was nothing random in how he moved, each shift of weight balanced, each step measured. It was not the walk of a tired man, but of one who had learned to conserve energy because life had once required it. Master Ortega watched longer this time. He knew patterns of movement better than most. The way the older man carried himself, the way his shoulders stayed even, the way his eyes tracked the space before his hands did. It wasn't the posture of a janitor. It was something else. He said nothing. He only nodded once to himself and turned back to the students. When the break came, Dylan leaned against the wall near the water cooler, still talking, still performing. His friends laughed at his every word, but their laughter was thinner now, polite rather than full. He noticed it too. His jokes didn't land the same. The air felt different. His pride demanded a reaction, and Walter's silence was too heavy a mirror to bear. "Guy doesn't even talk," he muttered to one of his friends. "Probably can't hear half of what I'm saying." The friend laughed, but not convincingly. Walter was mopping nearby again. The same slow pace, the same patience. When he straightened, his gaze swept the room once, not searching, but aware. Dylan caught it again and felt that strange tightening in his chest, a sense of being weighed and measured. The hum of the air conditioning filled the silence that followed. The rhythm of the gym resumed, but quieter now, as if the sound itself had learned respect. Outside, sunlight climbed higher over the Oakland skyline, reflecting off parked cars and the cracked asphalt of the street. Inside, the world of the gym seemed suspended between noise and quiet. Walter's bucket creaked as he pushed it toward the storage closet. For a moment, the sunlight caught the metal rim and flared, blinding white. He paused, hand on the handle, as though listening for something distant, a sound not in the room but somewhere far older. Dylan wiped sweat from his brow, unsettled by how the old man's calm seemed to steal attention without asking for it. Around him, voices faded and rose again, uncertain where to settle. Master Ortega called for the next round of drills, and the air filled once more with motion, the slap of bare feet, the rustle of uniforms, the short, sharp exhalations of training. Walter stepped out of the way, leaning briefly against the wall, his gaze tracing the lines of movement across the mat. There was no smile, no frown, only that still, unreadable expression. For a few seconds, he closed his eyes, and behind them flashed memories that did not belong to this clean, well-lit place. Dust storms, shouted orders, the weight of armor, the sound of metal striking stone. He exhaled once, quiet and deep, and when he opened his eyes again, the gym returned to view. The noise, the heat, the laughter. It was all smaller now, distant, like an echo of a life he had already lived. He picked up the mop again. The sound of it sliding across the floor marked the end of the morning session. Students drifted out, still chatting, but their laughter softened when they passed him. Not from guilt, most didn't even realize why, but from something instinctive, an unspoken acknowledgement of presence. Dylan was the last to leave. He lingered, wiping down his gloves, glancing toward the older man, who was now pouring the dirty water into the drain. The sight stirred something faint, like a question without words. He opened his mouth once, as if to say something, but stopped. There was nothing to say that wouldn't sound foolish. Outside, the sunlight had turned white and sharp. The hum of the city grew louder beyond the open door. Walter rinsed the bucket, set it upside down to dry and straighten. His shadow stretched long across the clean floor. For a brief second, before he stepped away, he looked at the mat at the space where youth had laughed at him, and something in his eyes softened. Not bitterness, not pride, but quiet recognition. He turned, picked up his jacket, and walked out, the sound of his boots fading against the polished tiles. The room seemed emptier after he left. Even the hum of the lights felt louder. Master Ortega watched him go from across the gym, thoughtful, unmoving. He knew better than most that silence had many languages, and that some of them spoke louder than words. When the door closed behind Walter, the reflection of sunlight on the window pane lingered a while longer, trembling in the dust before fading. The mats gleamed, the floor shone, and for the first time in a long while, the Bayview Academy felt less like a place for noise and more like a space where something older, something deeper, was waiting to return. That night, long after the gym had emptied, Ortega locked up and paused by the cleaning closet. The faint scent of soap and metal lingered. He looked down at the mop and bucket, still damp, and smiled faintly, though he could not have said why. Some lessons, he thought, arrive without being spoken. And somewhere across town, Walter Reed walked home through the quiet streets, the noise of the day fading behind him. The streetlights cast long shadows that followed him down cracked sidewalks. In his pocket, his hand brushed against a small piece of metal cold, worn smooth with time. He held it for a moment, then let it go, the faintest echo of steel against his fingers. He didn't need to look at it to remember. The memory lived in his movements now, in every quiet breath he took, in every floor he cleaned without complaint. The city's noise grew distant, replaced by the steady rhythm of his steps. And in that rhythm there was peace, the peace of a man who had survived what others could not, and who now lived not to prove, but to remind. The silence beneath the sound had only just begun. The next morning came gray and cool over Oakland, a thin fog hugging the streets like the breath of a city that had not yet decided to wake. The Bayview Martial Arts Academy stood quiet under the dim light, its windows dark, the echo of yesterday's noise long gone. Walter Reed arrived before anyone else. He always did. The key turned silently in the maintenance door, and he stepped inside with a slow, steady motion that carried the weight of years. The faint smell of sweat and rubber greeted him, familiar now, not unpleasant. He set down his thermos on the bench and stood still for a moment, listening to the stillness before he began his work. He mopped the same floor where laughter had once filled the air, his strokes even and patient. The echoes of yesterday lingered faintly, the sharp sound of sneakers against the mat, the scattered laughter that had followed Dylan's cruel joke. He had not been angry then. Anger was a luxury long burned out of him, replaced by something deeper and quieter. He knew what it meant to carry humiliation like a shadow. It didn't sting anymore. It simply reminded him of how people reveal themselves when they think no one is watching. As he worked, the light began to shift. Golden rays spilled through the high windows, softening the edges of the gym. He could see dust motes dancing in the beams, weightless and free, and for a brief moment his chest tightened with memory. Not of this place, but of another morning long ago, when the air had smelled of dust and diesel instead of polish and detergent. It came to him in fragments, sand rising in the desert wind, the taste of iron on his tongue, the hum of a helicopter above the horizon. He remembered the metallic click of his rifle's safety, the sound of his own breath behind the mask, the calm that came before violence. He had been younger then, stronger perhaps, but also heavier inside. Every day had carried the same question: who would come back and who would not? His mind wandered to the faces that had followed him through the years. Men shouting over static, men laughing in heat so dry it cracked their lips. Men who had trusted him with their lives. He had been their instructor, the one who taught them to survive the chaos, to move with precision when fear threatened to consume them. The body always knew before the mind, he had said once, and he still believed it. That truth was etched into his bones now. A soft thud behind him drew him back. The main door had opened, and early students were trickling in, their chatter beginning to fill the room. Walter straightened and rolled the mop bucket aside. The world of war receded like a tide, leaving behind only the calm surface he wore each day. Dylan arrived later, his stride confident as always, but there was a trace of restlessness in his eyes, as though sleep had not quite settled the unease that had begun the day before. He greeted his friends loud enough for the room to hear, but his laughter didn't carry the same sharpness. His jokes fell flat, and he noticed it. The memory of the janitor's steady gaze still lingered like an echo he couldn't shake. As the warm-up began, Dylan found himself glancing toward the back corner, where Walter was quietly arranging supplies. The man's movements were exact, almost too exact. Dylan frowned, annoyed at himself for caring. Why should it matter? He was the fighter, the rising talent. The old man was just the janitor. But the thought didn't hold. There had been something in that gaze, a weight that spoke of experience, something older than strength. It had unnerved him because it had made him feel small, and Dylan Cole did not like feeling small. When the drills ended, the class shifted into sparring rounds. The mats came alive again with motion and noise, gloves snapping, feet sliding, bodies colliding. Dylan threw himself into the rhythm, striking harder, faster, as if he could punch the memory away. Yet each movement brought the image of Walter's calm face closer to the surface. He didn't understand why it bothered him so much, only that it did. By mid-morning, his frustration had grown into arrogance. Between rounds, when Walter passed with his mop again, Dylan called out to him, his voice sharp enough to slice through the noise. "Hey, old man," he said, loud enough for the others to hear. "You ever do anything besides clean up after real fighters?" The words hung in the air. Some of the students laughed awkwardly, but not many. Even the younger ones felt something wrong in the tone. Walter stopped, his hands resting lightly on the mop handle. He turned his head just enough to meet Dylan's eyes. There was no anger, no surprise, only a silence that seemed to deepen the room. He held Dylan's gaze for a moment, and then, with quiet composure, said nothing. He simply nodded once and turned back to his work. That silence was worse than any insult. It cut through the noise, leaving Dylan flushed with a heat he couldn't name. His pride stung, and the laughter around him felt colder this time, less like support and more like a spotlight. He forced a grin, shook his head, and went back to training, but his punches no longer landed clean. From across the room, Master Ortega watched, his face unreadable. He had seen men like Dylan before, talented, proud, burning with the need to prove themselves. He had also seen men like Walter, those who had nothing left to prove and therefore could not be broken. Ortega said nothing, but his eyes followed the janitor as he moved. Something in the man's balance, the quiet control of his body, stirred an old memory. When the session ended, Dylan lingered again, refusing to let the silence settle. He waited until the others had gone, and then called out, "Hey, you, Walter, right?" The older man stopped, but didn't turn. Dylan took a few steps closer, his sneakers squeaking faintly against the clean floor. "You used to fight, didn't you?" he said. The question came out half as challenge, half as curiosity. Walter didn't answer at first. He set the mop back in the bucket, adjusted the handle, and finally looked at him. His voice, when it came, was low and even. "I've fought enough." The simplicity of the answer frustrated Dylan. "Yeah? Maybe you should show us sometime. I mean, we could all learn a thing or two about old school moves." He laughed, but the sound rang hollow. "Come on, don't tell me you're afraid of a little sparring." The remark drew a couple of students back from the hallway, sensing something happening. Walter's eyes moved from Dylan to them and then back again. The pause stretched long enough for the air to tighten between them. "I don't fight for amusement," Walter said quietly. His voice had the texture of gravel, worn but unyielding. Then he turned and walked away. Dylan stood frozen, his fists clenched. The refusal burned worse than mockery. He felt as if the man had dismissed him, not out of fear, but out of irrelevance. That was harder to bear. Around him, the few onlookers exchanged uncertain glances. After the gym emptied, Master Ortega approached Walter. You handle yourself calmly, he said, his tone neutral, almost conversational. Walter shrugged slightly. There's no lesson in anger. Ortega nodded. No, but sometimes anger reveals where the real work begins. Walter met his eyes for a moment and gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. Then he gathered his cleaning supplies and left. Outside, the day had brightened, but the city seemed heavy with memory. Walter walked the familiar route back toward his small apartment near the port. The streets were cracked, lined with murals fading under sun and rain, colors bleeding into each other. He passed children playing basketball on a corner, the bounce of the ball echoing against the concrete, and for a moment he saw not them, but the past. The rhythm of drills, the weight of gear, the sound of orders shouted through dust. He had learned long ago how to silence the noise, how to fold the chaos into a single point of calm. It was what had kept him alive. It was what he carried now into every quiet place he worked. But sometimes, as he walked alone, he wondered if that same calm had also turned into distance, a wall between himself and the world. That night the dream came again, the one that returned when prideful voices broke through his silence. He saw the desert, the heat, the shimmer of mirage on the horizon. He was back in the compound, hearing the whistle of wind over sand, feeling the tremor of the ground before an explosion. His hands moved by memory, pushing others toward cover, guiding them with precision. He remembered the moment he had turned to see the boy, no older than Dylan, running back for a fallen comrade. He had shouted, but the sound had come too late. The blast swallowed the sky. He woke with a start, breath shallow, room dark except for the thin line of streetlight across the wall. His hands trembled, though the air was still. It took several minutes for his pulse to settle. He stared at the ceiling, feeling the weight of years pressing down. Morning came again. He went back to the gym as always, his expression calm, his steps measured. But beneath that calm was a quiet storm, not of anger, but of understanding. He knew boys like Dylan. He had trained them. He had buried them. The day began as it always did. The students arrived, filling the gym with energy and noise. Dylan moved through the drills with extra force, trying to prove something, though he wasn't sure what. Walter watched from the corner as he cleaned, noting the impatience in the young man's movements, the way pride made his shoulders tight, his timing sloppy. He had seen it before, the arrogance of someone who thought strength was measured only by power. As the sun climbed higher, the challenge that had been building in the air finally took form. Dylan tossed his gloves aside after a round and looked toward Walter, his voice carrying across the room. You think you're too good to spar, old man? Or you just know you can't keep up? The laughter that followed was forced. Even those who chuckled did so with unease. Master Ortega looked up from the far side, but he didn't stop it. There were lessons he knew that could not be taught with words. Walter set down the mop. His movements were slow, deliberate. He turned toward Dylan and studied him. Not the way a man looks at an opponent, but the way a teacher studies a student about to fail a test he doesn't understand. I don't fight for fun, he said again, his voice steady as stone. Then after a pause he added, but sometimes a lesson requires more than words. The room fell silent. Dylan's smirk flickered, then returned. So you'll do it? Walter didn't answer. He walked toward the center of the mat, his boots soft against the floor, his gaze fixed forward. When he stopped, the air in the room seemed to shift. It wasn't challenge or threat that filled the space. It was gravity. Dylan stepped up, trying to mask the tremor of uncertainty with bravado. The students formed a loose circle, their whispers fading into quiet. Even the hum of the lights seemed to dim. Master Ortega remained still in the corner, eyes narrowed, sensing that whatever was about to happen would not be about victory or defeat. Walter loosened his shoulders once, his posture calm. His face was unreadable, his breathing steady. He did not raise his fists, did not bend his knees, did not take any stance known to the gym. He simply stood there waiting. Dylan felt his pulse quicken. He grinned again, forcing courage through his veins. Don't say I didn't warn you, he said, stepping forward. Walter's gaze did not change. In that moment, the entire gym seemed to hold its breath. the sound of distant traffic faded. All that remained was the quiet between them, a silence heavy enough to break the world in half. And when Dylan moved, lunging forward with all the strength and pride he had built his name upon, Walter moved too, but not the way anyone expected. The lesson was about to begin. For a moment, everything in the gym stood still. The air thickened with anticipation, the smell of sweat and rubber, heavy as the sound of Dylan's breathing, filled the silence. Walter stood in the center of the mat, his boots planted firmly, his posture calm, his gaze fixed on the younger man. There was no aggression in his stance, no tension in his shoulders, only a composure that unsettled everyone who saw it. It was the kind of calm that comes from having already faced worse than whatever was about to happen. Around them, the students formed a loose ring, their faces uncertain. No one dared to speak. Even the hum of the air conditioner seemed to fade beneath the weight of the moment. Dylan took a step forward, the mat giving slightly beneath his bare feet. He rolled his shoulders, lifted his hands, and shifted into the stance he had practiced thousands of times. His heartbeat echoed in his ears. He could feel the pulse of energy coursing through him, the familiar rhythm that came before every match, the thrill of being watched, the certainty that this moment would prove his superiority once and for all. To him, the janitor was no opponent, just an old man standing in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was going to end this quickly, with a strike that would make everyone laugh and forget why they had been so quiet. Walter didn't move. He stood like a mountain, steady and silent. His eyes didn't follow Dylan's hands but his center, the way his weight shifted between each breath. Years of training had burned into him, the instinct to read intention before motion. He could see the fight before it happened, the way a veteran reads the wind before the first shot is fired. His body relaxed even more, the tension draining until he was no longer preparing for a fight, but waiting for the inevitable. Dylan launched first, as everyone knew he would. His right foot slid forward, hips twisting with practiced precision, his left hand snapping out to feint before a sharp kick cut through the air toward Walter's ribs. It was fast, sharp enough to impress his peers, but Walter had already stepped aside before the kick reached him. The motion was small, barely visible, but it left Dylan striking nothing but air. His balance faltered for half a second, and Walter's hand brushed against his shoulder, steadying him almost gently before he stepped back again. The contact was so light it could have been mistaken for kindness, but to Dylan, it burned like mockery. He spun around, his pride stinging, and swung again this time with a flurry of strikes, faster, harder. Walter moved like water, flowing around the attacks without ever meeting them head-on. His movements were quiet, deliberate, every shift economical. The sound of Dylan's fists cutting the air filled the gym, punctuated only by the shuffle of feet on the mat. But no matter how hard he pressed, he couldn't touch him. The students watched in stunned silence. What had started as entertainment was becoming something else, something uncomfortable. They had seen plenty of sparring matches before, but this was different. It wasn't just skill, it was control. Walter wasn't fighting to win. He was demonstrating mastery over the very idea of conflict. Dylan's frustration boiled over. He feinted left and tried to sweep Walter's legs with a low kick, putting all his weight into it. For the first time, Walter's body reacted with visible force. He stepped into the motion, his knee rotating with precision, intercepting the sweep and shifting the younger man's momentum. Dylan's body turned, his own speed betraying him, and before he could recover, Walter's hand caught his arm, redirected his motion, and sent him sprawling to the mat with a thud that silenced the room completely. It wasn't violent. There was no pain, no damage, just sudden realization. Dylan lay on the mat, staring up at the ceiling, his chest heaving, his pride cracked open in the quiet that followed. Walter stepped back, giving him space. He didn't take a stance or prepare to continue. He simply waited, watching, his expression unreadable. Dylan climbed back to his feet, his breath ragged. Again, he muttered under his breath, though no one had asked him to. He lunged forward, fueled by anger now more than form, throwing a punch that carried frustration instead of discipline. Walter's hand rose, not to block, but to guide. He caught Dylan's wrist in motion, pivoted slightly, and used the younger man's own speed to pull him off balance again. This time, Walter didn't let him fall. He steadied him once more and held his gaze for a long second before releasing his grip. "Enough," Walter said quietly. The word was soft, but it carried through the room like a command. The silence that followed was absolute. Dylan froze, his fists still half raised, his breath harsh in his throat. Something in the older man's voice cut through the adrenaline, something that didn't sound like triumph or pity but finality. Around them, the students looked from one to the other, their earlier excitement replaced by an uneasy respect. Walter stepped back and nodded to Master Ortega, who had been watching from the edge of the mat, his expression unreadable. The instructor didn't move at first. He seemed to be studying the air itself, as though trying to understand the transformation that had just taken place. Finally, he nodded once, slowly, and said, "Class dismissed." The students began to move, their voices low, uncertain. Dylan stayed where he was, his fists unclenching, his arms falling slowly to his sides. He couldn't meet Walter's eyes. For the first time, he felt the depth of what had just happened. This wasn't a defeat in the ordinary sense. It wasn't about points or pride. He had been dismantled without being hurt, humbled without humiliation. It was something deeper, a lesson he didn't yet know how to name. Walter turned away, walking toward the bucket and mop waiting in the corner. The sound of his boots against the mat was almost a whisper. Dylan watched him go, confusion and anger twisting inside him. The man didn't even look back. He simply returned to the quiet rhythm of his work, as though nothing out of the ordinary had happened. One of the younger students broke the silence with a nervous whisper. "What was that?" Master Ortega answered before anyone else could. "That," he said softly, "was control." Walter wrung out the mop, the handle creaking in his hands, and began to clean the section of floor near the edge of the mat. The students filed out slowly, still looking back, their earlier laughter gone. Dylan stayed a moment longer, his pride in pieces, his thoughts a storm of confusion. When he finally turned to leave, Ortega called his name. "Dylan," he said, his tone gentle but firm, "you saw something today that most men never see until it's too late. Learn from it." Dylan didn't answer. He walked out into the daylight, the sound of the mop behind him echoing in his mind. Walter finished his work and left quietly after locking up the storage closet. The streets outside were alive with noise. The rush of traffic, voices spilling from nearby cafes, the distant hum of the city. But for him, the world moved differently, slower. He walked to the bus stop, the same route he always took, his mind already miles away. He thought of the young man's anger, the impatience in his movements. It reminded him of faces he hadn't seen in years, recruits full of bravado, eyes bright with youth, too certain of their own strength. Most of them had learned the truth too late. He had tried to teach them patience, the discipline of stillness, but few had understood until the world itself had taught them the hard way. As the bus rumbled through the streets, Walter's reflection flickered in the window, layered over the cityscape passing by. He saw in it not the janitor's face, but the ghost of the soldier he once was. He had carried many titles, Marine, instructor, mentor, but none had weighed as heavily as the silence that followed the last one. He remembered the day he left the Corps, the papers signed, the uniform folded, the medals packed into a small box he had never opened again. He remembered the weight of his students' eyes, the ones who hadn't come home. Their faces haunted him in quiet moments, in dreams that came with the rhythm of his heartbeat. He had promised himself that he would never raise his hand in violence again, not unless there was no other choice. That vow had kept him alive in peace the same way discipline had kept him alive in war. When the bus stopped near his small apartment, he stepped off and stood for a moment beneath the faded mural on the wall, a painted image of a lion, half peeled away by time. It was a neighborhood landmark, something the children walked past every day without thinking. But to Walter, it was a reminder. In another life, they had called him the Lion. Now he was just a man trying to live quietly, to let the world move without his interference. That evening, the sun sank low, turning the city gold. Walter sat on his porch, sipping from his thermos, watching the sky burn to amber. He could still feel the tension of the gym in his hands, The moment when he had caught Dylan's wrist and redirected his momentum. It hadn't been a victory. It had been a necessity. A warning, perhaps a reminder that strength without understanding leads nowhere. At the same time, across the city, Dylan sat alone in his apartment, gloves tossed aside, replaying the scene again and again. Every move, every motion, every quiet breath of the old man came back to him. He had thought he understood power, but what he had seen was something else entirely. It wasn't speed or strength, it was presence, control, a kind of mastery that came from somewhere deeper. He didn't tell anyone about it, not his friends, not his coach. The humiliation was too raw, the lesson too unclear. But deep down, beneath the sting of pride, something had shifted. At the Bayview Academy, word spread quietly. No one mocked the janitor anymore. No one joked when he passed. The story grew in whispers, half legend already, the tale of the old man who had faced the academy's best and barely moved. Master Ortega didn't correct them. He only nodded when asked, saying that some lessons are best left in silence. Walter returned the next morning, as he always did at dawn. The gym smelled clean, the air cool, the mats still bearing faint marks of the previous day's training. He began his work without a word, his movements steady, the rhythm of the mop against the floor, the only sound in the quiet hall. He didn't look for Dylan, though he knew the young man would be there. He didn't need to. The lesson had already been given. What came next was not his to teach. It was up to the boy to find meaning in what he had seen. And as the sun rose higher, spilling its light across the gym's walls, Walter Reed continued his quiet work, carrying within him the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths. For him, the fight was already over. But for Dylan, it had just begun. The days that followed were quieter at the Bayview Academy. The echo of the confrontation between Walter and Dylan lingered in the air like smoke that refused to clear. The students trained as they always had, but something in the rhythm of their movements had changed. They spoke softer, laughed less, and carried themselves with a subtle awareness of the space they occupied. For the first time, they began to understand that the room itself held memory, that the mats, the walls, the faint scent of sweat and cleaning solution were witnesses to more than just drills and competitions. Walter came in each morning as he always did, his routine untouched by what had happened. He moved through the gym with the same steady pace, his bucket rattling faintly as he crossed the floor. But beneath his quiet exterior, something had shifted as well. He had spent years living unseen, content to let the world pass around him, yet the stillness that once felt like refuge now carried a faint vibration of unease. He had not meant to reveal anything about himself that day, but in one motion, one brief demonstration, he had let the past step back into the present. Master Ortega had noticed at first the precision, the grace, the discipline that no ordinary man could fake. He had spent a lifetime teaching martial artists how to read energy, to sense presence before movement, and when Walter moved, Ortega had recognized something ancient in his rhythm. After the students left each day, he found himself lingering longer, watching Walter mop the floors, searching for answers he hadn't yet asked. On the third morning after the fight, the inevitable happened. As the gym emptied and the last of the students filed out, Ortega approached the older man. The room was quiet except for the soft squeak of wet rubber against tile. Walter didn't look up until the footsteps stopped near him. "You used to train men like him, didn't you?" Ortega asked. Walter paused, his hand tightening briefly on the mop handle. Then, without looking up, he said, "I trained men nothing like him." The answer was quiet, almost lost in the echo of the empty room. Ortega waited, but Walter offered no more. He wrung out the mop, leaned it against the bucket, and walked toward the supply closet. "I know that control," Ortega said, his voice following him. "That stillness doesn't come from sport. It comes from somewhere else, somewhere harder." Walter stopped in the doorway, the faint light casting his shadow long across the wall. "Knowing where it comes from won't change what it is," he said. "Some lessons can't be taught twice." Then he closed the door gently behind him. The next morning, Dylan returned earlier than usual. He didn't come for the warm-up drills or the sparring sessions. He came for the silence before class, the half hour when the gym still belonged to Walter and his mop. He found him there, as expected, moving slowly across the mats. Dylan hesitated near the entrance. The memory of his fall, the way the world had seemed to tilt beneath him that day, still haunted him. He had been too proud to speak before, too consumed by the sting of defeat to acknowledge what he had witnessed. But the silence of the past few days had done its work. Pride had turned to curiosity, and curiosity to something like respect. He approached carefully, not wanting to startle him. "Mr. Reed," he said. Walter looked up, the name sounding unfamiliar. Few people ever said it now. He nodded once. "I wanted to apologize," Dylan said quickly, his words tumbling over each other. "For what I said, for how I acted. I thought I understood what strength meant, but I didn't. You showed me that." Walter studied him for a moment, then went back to mopping. "Understanding doesn't come from seeing once," he said. "It comes from living long enough to understand what not to do with strength." Dylan frowned slightly. "I'd like to learn that," he said after a pause. "If you'd teach me." Walter's hand stopped mid-motion. The air between them thickened with something unspoken. When he finally turned, his gaze was sharp, not angry, but probing. "What do you think you want to learn?" he asked. Dylan hesitated. "What you did that day. How you moved like that. Like you knew what I was going to do before I did it." Walter looked down at the floor. "That's not something you learn in a gym," he said. "That's something you learn when your mistakes cost more than pride." For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Walter sighed and leaned on the mop handle. "You want to learn," he said at last. "Then start by cleaning the floor." Dylan blinked. "What?" "Clean it," Walter repeated, handing him the mop. "You'll understand later." There was no room for argument in his tone. Dylan took the handle awkwardly and began pushing it across the mat. The motion felt ridiculous at first, demeaning even, but Walter said nothing. He simply watched, then finally turned and walked toward the door. "Same time tomorrow," he said before leaving. That night, word spread quickly that Dylan had stayed late to clean the gym. Some students laughed, assuming it was punishment. Others looked confused, but Master Ortega said nothing. When one of the younger boys asked about it, he only smiled faintly and said, "It's good for him." Days passed and Dylan kept coming early, mopping floors before training. Walter rarely spoke. Sometimes he corrected the angle of Dylan's movement, showing him how to shift his weight so the motion flowed instead of fought. "Everything's about balance," he would say. "The floor doesn't care how strong you are. It only reflects what you give it." Over time, Dylan began to notice details he'd never seen before. The way the mop glided when he didn't force it, the sound it made when it caught friction from uneven pressure, the rhythm his body found when he stopped trying to control it. It was a strange kind of meditation, one that stripped away impatience and pride piece by piece. One afternoon, after the others left, Master Ortega approached Walter. "You're training him," he said. Walter didn't deny it. "I'm showing him what fighting is supposed to protect, not what it's supposed to destroy." Ortega nodded slowly. "He's listening, more than I expected." "He's listening because he's failed," Walter said. "Failure opens the door. What he does after, that's what decides who he'll be." That evening, as Walter prepared to leave, a man entered the gym whom Ortega hadn't seen in years. A tall, broad-shouldered veteran named Harris, who now ran a local veterans support organization. His face lit up the moment he saw Walter. "I'll be damned," Harris said, his voice breaking the quiet. "Walter Reed. I thought you were dead." Every head in the room turned. Walter froze, his body going still as stone. "That was a long time ago," he said finally. Harris stepped forward, shaking his head. "You saved my brother in Mosul. You trained half the men in that unit. We used to call you the Lion." The room fell silent. Dylan, still holding the mop, looked between them in disbelief. Ortega's face softened in recognition. The stories he had heard from his own Marine students years ago came flooding back, whispers of a man who had led close combat training in impossible conditions, who had turned chaos into order. Walter's jaw tightened. "That name doesn't belong here," he said quietly. Harris nodded slowly, understanding. "Maybe not, but people should know who you are. You've earned that." Walter shook his head. "All I've earned is silence. Let the past rest where it belongs." He picked up his jacket and started for the door. But the damage was done. By the next morning, everyone at the academy knew. The janitor wasn't just an old man who moved with strange precision. He had once been a legend, a man who had trained soldiers, led missions, and carried scars the rest of the world would never see. The whispers spread through the gym like wildfire, not cruel this time, but awed, reverent even. When Walter arrived, every student stopped what they were doing. Some nodded respectfully. Others averted their eyes, unsure how to face him now that they knew. Walter ignored them all, went to his work, and started cleaning as usual. Dylan approached him later, the mop still in his hand. "You were the lion," he said quietly. Walter didn't look up. "I was a soldier," he said. "A man does what he has to, and then he learns to live with what that means." Dylan hesitated. "Why hide it?" "Because stories like mine end with medals and funerals," Walter said. "I was lucky enough to avoid both." He looked at the young man then, his gaze steady. "Don't chase titles. They're just cages made of other people's expectations." Dylan nodded slowly, his respect deepening. The man before him was no longer a janitor, nor simply a fighter. He was something more profound, a man who had walked through hell and chosen peace over glory. Later that week, Master Ortega organized a small gathering for the Veterans Charity, inviting Harris to speak. When Walter's name was mentioned, he refused to stand or accept praise. But as Harris spoke of the lives he had saved, the room's silence grew heavy with emotion. Dylan listened from the back, realizing that everything he had admired in fighters, their strength, their pride, their victories paled in comparison to what he saw in this man's humility. After the event, Walter slipped out quietly into the evening. The city was alive around him, neon lights shimmering on the wet pavement. He walked toward the edge of the bay where the water reflected the skyline. The sound of waves mingled with distant traffic. He stood there a long time, hands in his pockets, the cool wind brushing against his face. He thought of the soldiers he had lost, the ones who never found peace, and wondered whether they would forgive him for finding it. Behind him, footsteps approached. Dylan stopped a few feet away. "I didn't know," he said quietly, "about any of it." Walter didn't turn. "You weren't supposed to. You could have told us," Dylan said. "I didn't want respect for what I was," Walter replied. "I wanted you to find respect for what you could be." They stood in silence for a while, the wind carrying the sound of the city over the water. Then Dylan said, "I think I understand now." Walter smiled faintly. "You understand one thing. That's enough for now." The boy nodded, then turned back toward the gym, leaving the older man alone by the water. Walter watched the waves break against the shore, their rhythm steady and eternal. The reflection of the city lights shimmered across the surface, broken and reformed with each movement, like memory itself, always changing, never truly gone. He closed his eyes and breathed deeply. For the first time in years, the weight on his chest lifted just slightly. The world behind him had found out who he was, but for once it didn't matter. He was no longer the Lion of Mosul. He was just Walter Reed, a man who cleaned floors, taught lessons, and lived quietly among the noise of others. And for the first time, that felt like enough. The morning sun broke gently through the tall windows of the Bayview Academy, spilling amber light across the polished floors. Dust motes floated in the air like fragments of memory, catching the light with every movement of the breeze. The gym had grown quieter in the weeks since Walter's past had come to light. The students no longer laughed loudly or treated training as a contest of ego. Their movements had become slower, more deliberate, as though they sensed the weight of something sacred in the space where they stood. And at the heart of it all, Walter Reed continued his quiet work, unaltered by the reverence that now surrounded him. He mopped the same floors he had mopped for years, his motions calm and steady. But inside him, the rhythm had changed. It was no longer an act of invisibility. It had become a form of meditation, an act of grounding. The gym, once a place of noise and competition, had become for him a sanctuary, a place where the noise of the world dimmed enough for his soul to breathe. Every sound now had meaning: the slap of gloves against mats, the echo of laughter when a student mastered a movie, even the soft squeak of his mop as it traced familiar lines across the floor. Dylan had changed too. The arrogance that once defined him had been replaced by quiet determination. He still trained hard, but his energy was different, measured, thoughtful, humble. He no longer saw fighting as a way to dominate, but as a way to understand himself. Walter had not agreed to become his formal mentor, but in practice he had become exactly that. Each morning, before class began, Dylan helped him clean. They worked side by side in silence, and though no formal lessons were spoken, Dylan learned more in those moments than in years of training. Master Ortega observed them from a distance. He saw how Dylan's movements had begun to mirror Walter's, not the physical ones, but the rhythm of them, the patience, the steadiness. He saw how the boy now paused before reacting, how he began to see his opponents not as enemies but as reflections of himself. It was a transformation that few achieved even after decades of practice, and Ortega knew it was not his doing. It was Walter's. One afternoon, Ortega invited Walter into his office. The old man entered reluctantly, as though unsure why he was there. The space was small but filled with warmth, the walls lined with photographs of students, trophies gleaming in the sunlight. Ortega gestured for him to sit. "I've been thinking about something," he said, folding his hands on the desk. "About legacy." Walter tilted his head slightly. "That's a word people use when they start to run out of time," he said with a faint smile. "Perhaps," Ortega admitted, "but I don't mean it in the grand sense. I mean the kind of legacy that lives in people, not plaques. What you've done here, the way the students look at you, it's not something I could have taught them." Walter's expression remained calm, but his eyes softened. "I didn't come here to teach," he said quietly. "Maybe not," Ortega said, "but life doesn't always ask what we came for. It decides what we're meant to do." Walter leaned back slightly, his gaze drifting toward the window. "I've spent years trying to forget what I used to be," he said. "Now everyone knows, and somehow that's supposed to mean something. But the truth is, it doesn't change what I am now. I'm just a man trying to live quietly." Ortega nodded slowly. "And maybe that's exactly why it matters. You remind them that strength and humility can live in the same body, that peace isn't weakness. They needed that lesson. So did Dylan." Walter said nothing for a long while. Finally, he nodded once, his voice low. "He'll surpass us both one day," he said. "He just doesn't know it yet." The days moved forward with a kind of peaceful rhythm. Dylan's growth became evident to everyone in the academy. He sparred with restraint, his strikes precise but never cruel. When others lost their temper, he calmed them. When a younger student fell, he was the first to help them up. The discipline Walter had shown him seeped into every corner of his life. One evening, after a particularly long training session, Dylan found Walter sitting outside the gym, his mop and bucket beside him, watching the city as it faded into dusk. The streets glowed with the orange hue of streetlights, and the sound of distant traffic hummed softly through the air. Dylan sat beside him, not saying anything at first. After a while, he asked, "Do you ever miss it? The life you had before?" Walter took a long breath, eyes fixed on the horizon. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but not for the reasons you think. I don't miss the fight or the noise. I miss the moments in between, the silence right before everything started. It reminded me that I was still alive." Dylan nodded, understanding more than he could say. "You ever think of going back? Not to fight, but to teach again? People would listen to you." Walter smiled faintly. "I'm teaching now," he said, "just not in the way people expect." They sat in silence again, watching the world change color around them. The city lights shimmered against the bay, and the soft wind carried the scent of salt and metal. Walter's face, lit by the fading sun, looked older than usual, but there was peace in his expression, a kind of quiet acceptance that Dylan had never seen in anyone else. A week later, a letter arrived at the academy. It bore the insignia of the Veterans Foundation and was addressed to Walter Reed. Ortega handed it to him after class. Walter read it silently, his expression unreadable. When he finished, he folded the paper neatly and slipped it into his pocket. "Everything all right?" Ortega asked. "They're opening a new outreach center," Walter said. "They want me to oversee the training program for veterans adjusting to civilian life. Mentorship, physical recovery, mental health. It's good work." Ortega smiled. "You'd be perfect for it." Walter hesitated. Maybe, but it would mean leaving here. The words settled heavily between them. The idea of the gym without Walter felt wrong, like silence after a song that had yet to finish. Ortega didn't try to persuade him either way. He simply said, "Whatever you choose, make sure it's peace you're walking toward, not guilt." That night, Walter stayed late after everyone had gone. The gym was empty, the mats rolled up, the air still. He walked slowly across the floor, his footsteps echoing softly. The room carried his memories now of the day he first walked in unnoticed, of the laughter that had once stung, of the boy who had challenged him and become something more. He stopped at the center of the mat and stood there for a long moment, eyes closed, listening to the silence. The next morning, he told Ortega his decision. He would accept the offer, but return often. "This place doesn't need me anymore," he said. "That's how I know it's ready to stand on its own." His departure wasn't dramatic. There were no speeches, no ceremonies. He simply came in one last time, mopped the floor, and said goodbye to each student with quiet words of encouragement. When he reached Dylan, he handed him the mop handle. "Everything you need to know is in this," Walter said. Dylan smiled faintly, though his eyes glistened. "I'll take care of it." "I know you will," Walter replied. "And remember, control isn't about power. It's about knowing when not to use it." The door closed behind him, and his footsteps faded down the corridor. Months passed. The academy continued to grow, its reputation spreading across the city. People spoke of the calm atmosphere, the respect that filled the space, the way students carried themselves with quiet confidence. Dylan became an instructor, guiding others not with arrogance, but with the same patience Walter had shown him. Under his care, the gym became more than a place to train. It became a refuge, a community built on empathy and discipline. Walter's work at the Veterans Center flourished. He taught workshops for men and women struggling to rebuild their lives, helping them find balance through movement and meditation. The lessons he had learned, the ones born from pain, humility, and stillness, became the foundation of his program. He never spoke of his past exploits, never shared the stories that others turned into legend. Instead, he spoke of quiet strength, of forgiveness, of the courage it took to live without armor. Sometimes on weekends, he returned to Bayview. The students greeted him with warmth and respect, though he always brushed off their praise with a small wave of his hand. Dylan, now a teacher in his own right, sparred with him occasionally, though never competitively. Their movements were fluid, almost like a dance, each one anticipating the other's next step, their connection silent but profound. One evening after a session, they sat on the gym steps, looking out at the city lights. Dylan turned to him and said, "You were right, about peace." Walter smiled faintly. "Took you long enough to figure that out." "It's harder than fighting," Dylan said. "It always is," Walter replied. They sat quietly for a while, the distant sound of laughter drifting from the street. Then Dylan asked, "Do you ever regret anything?" Walter thought for a long moment. "Regret?" he said softly. "No, I've made mistakes, but regret keeps you in the past. I live with what I've done, and I try to do better today. That's all any man can do." The sky deepened into twilight, and the first stars appeared. Walter stood, brushing off his hands. "Come on," he said, "let's lock up. You've got work to do tomorrow." Dylan nodded, watching as the older man gathered his things. There was a grace in his movements still, the same quiet control that had once silenced a room full of laughter. It was no longer intimidating. It was comforting, grounding, human. As they left the gym, Walter paused at the door, looking back one last time. The mats gleamed softly in the dim light, the air still holding the faint scent of sweat and detergent. It was a small place, but in its walls lived something larger than either of them, a truth passed from one soul to another. He smiled, then turned away. Years later, the story of the janitor who had once humbled the Academy star became a quiet legend among the students. But those who had known him best didn't speak of the fight. They spoke of his calm, his patience, his humility. They spoke of how he had changed them without ever raising his voice. And in every motion, in every lesson, in every act of kindness that spread from that place, a piece of Walter Reed lived on. He had once been the lion, But in the end, it was not the roar that defined him. It was the silence that followed and the peace it carried. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. It helps us bring more powerful stories to life. Watch our next video for another journey of courage and redemption, and explore more stories that reveal the strength hidden in silence. Like, share, and spread the message, because one story can change how we see the world.